Hello everyone, fantastic to be here. I'm Josh Poulter, I'm a strategic foresight expert from the OECD based in Paris, and I warmly welcome you to today's panel Population Pop Quiz, Are We Ready for Peak Humanity? This session is going to look at the complexities and implications of the global population as we reach what is really a success story of 8 billion people. Okay. Now, we futurists might be tempted to think that demographics and population are one of those things that are quite stable and easy to predict, or something that is the numbers that evolve gradually in the background while we focus on other things. And this panel should overturn that myth. So we're here to explore these issues from multiple angles: economics, health, development, and beyond. This topic for me is really an interdisciplinary dream, and I'm pleased to say that we have an interdisciplinary dream team among us as our panel to speak. So we have James Pomeroy. James's work focuses on long-term trends and their impact on the economy and policy decisions, and his expertise in demographic and data and global economics will provide some valuable insights for our panel. Next, we have Dr. Alex Ezeh, who is a professor of global health at Drexel University. And Dr. Ezeh's extensive experience in urban health, population change, and knowledge-based institutions positions him as a leading authority on today's topic. And then lastly, we have Narue Shiki, Futures Lead at UNDP. Narue's role involves shaping proactive and systemic approaches to consider the future, which really aligns perfectly with our discussion today. So, James, why don't you set the scene for us? What do demographic variations worldwide tell us about our current global position, and what are some of the trends you think we should be keeping an eye out for?
Fantastic. Well, firstly, thank you everyone for joining us in this session. I think you've made the right choice in a very, very crowded field. That demographics are really, really interesting. And then far more interesting than most people think, because as Josh sort of just alluded to, most people think about demographics and they think boring. They either think nothing's changing, or they think something's going to happen magically in 50 years' time. It's well out of any of our sort of time horizons. But a lot of the work I do is basically trying to drill home this point to people that demographics matters today, it matters tomorrow, it matters every single day. It's one of the most important things underpinning systemic change in the global economy. And we write about this from three sort of broad lenses, and I'm sure we can come back to at least some of them. One is, I think, a lot of Western economies have really, really underestimated quite how sharply birth rates are dropping, and what we're seeing in terms of population changes that's bringing around. It's going to mean huge difficulties in the future in terms of fiscal positions, in terms of working age populations, huge potential challenges there. We also probably underestimate quite how dramatically populations are changing in many parts of the emerging world, with rapid population growth that brings with it some of its own challenges. Can we generate enough jobs, enough homes, high quality of living, all of those sorts of challenges? So almost every country in the world faces some sort of demographic hurdle, either today or in the future. And finally, the sort of big one on overlaying all of that is what happens in a world of more increased shocks. Be that because of climate change, be that because of war, be it because of whatever it turns out to be. How prepared are we as a society for massive migration flows across borders or within countries? And the sad fact is we're probably not as prepared as we probably need to be. So there's sort of the three things I spend a lot of my time thinking about, but to me demographics is absolutely crucial to underpinning everything we think about in the global economy.
Thank you very much, James, and I'm really vibing off the fact that we underestimate a lot of the really important things that population implies. You talked also about implications in terms of work, health, and other key factors of human well-being, and really how population is almost like a prism for some of the shocks that we experience as societies, that sort of refracts those experiences. So I'll turn to Alex to pick up on that point. You're an expert in global public health, but also with a background in demographics too. So what do you think are some of the things emerging today that we're not paying enough attention to and that we really should sharpen our focus on?
Thank you, Josh. So if you think about the concerns we have about demography or population, you go back to Malthus in the late 1700s. through LH in the 1960s to now, all our concerns has been focused on population growth and the implications it has for human health and well-being. Currently, there is a new issue that we think about, which is population decline. But when we think about population decline, the model that we have is the European experience across Europe, North America, Australia, and all that. And that model assumes that population decline is really comes around as is framed in terms of aging and healthier lives, longer lives, and all of those. That model is completely irrelevant when you come to low and middle income countries for four main reasons. The first is the issue of change in fertility. I think James mentioned about the low birth rates and below replacement level fertility. In Europe, it took them more than 100, 200 years, if you think about France, to move from a peak fertility to below replacement. From the 1700s, early 1700s to about 1940. In the UK, it was from 1800 to about 1940s, when it moved from about 5.7 children per woman to about less than 2 children per woman. In many low and middle income countries that have achieved below replacement level fertility, they've done that in a matter of 2 to 4 decades. So when you look at the shift and the timing of that change, one of the things it does is to change the structure of the population. When it changes, see, one of the things that drive population growth is what we call momentum, which is the population is like a pyramid. More people come into the reproductive ages than those who are living. When you have a reverse momentum, what happens? It's like a V. It means that fewer people are coming into the reproductive age than are living it. And so you think about countries like South Korea, for instance. Currently, there are 11.3 million women of childbearing age, 15 to 49. By the end of this century, there will be 3.4 million. So even if their fertility will triple, and the UN suggests that it will grow by 87%, the population will decline from 54 million to about 24 million. So when you think about Europe, the model of their population change is something really around a stable, stationary population that doesn't really decline. Even though it has been going through decades of below replacement level fertility, the population remains stable, pretty much. But in because of that length of time. But the second factor is also the issue of immigration. And when you think about immigration, it's about in-migration and emigration. And in many of these countries, because of the hundreds of years it took them to get there, they created policies that allowed them to manage immigration in a way that actually sustains continued population growth. So what does that mean? Think about the UK. The total fertility rate in the UK is about 1.6 children per woman now. And in Jamaica is about the same. The UN projects that between now and end of the century, the total fertility rate in Jamaica and the UK will be about the same, about between 1.4 and 1.6 children per woman. However, the population of the UK will increase from about 67 million people now to 70 million people by 2100. The population of Jamaica will drop from 2.9 million to about 890,000. That's a 70% decline in that population. So even though population decline is not an issue for the UK, it is a consequential issue for a country like Jamaica. So when we think about population aging and decline, we frame it in the concept of aging, we miss a lot of narratives that really affect low and middle income countries differently. I talked about migration. You know, Europe is a migratory group of people. You see them all over the world. That's why North America, Australia, New Zealand, and all over. And it's taken centuries to really build that framing. And currently, the immigration policy is such that it's able to allow young people to come into these countries, and that really, they come with a slightly higher fertility than in the other places. Many other countries and regions of the world are very different in terms of how they treat migration and the role it is. So for poorer countries and low and middle income countries, the question is that they will not have the capacity to attract immigrants from poorer countries. So their population decline will be driven and they will still be facing emigration of their young people. So the change in the population will then be very consequential for them because of the way migration works in that setting. It will be very different from what is going on in the UK. So when you think about population decline, let's reframe our thinking that the experiences of Europe will be the experiences of many low and middle income countries. It will not be, and we are not paying as much attention as we should to what is going on in low and middle income countries.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I'm noting down a number of different things that we as futurists need to keep on our minds, which is things like momentum and narrative and the importance of context. So we'll come back to some of those things in a moment. But just before, let's hand over to Narue. So you're a futurist. You're focused on the sustainable development agenda. We're from organizations that believe in the power of cooperation across borders, and we're in an event here which demonstrates the power of cooperation across borders. How is your work advancing some of those goals?
Well, thanks, Joshua, for having me here. And also, I think part of the reason I've joined the UN, and we talk about being futurists, and I wouldn't have joined the UN if I didn't believe that we could enact change and shape the future, and the work that I do reflects that. I think when it comes to our role in either shaping narratives or shaping strategies related to demographic shifts, I think I wanted to highlight three main things. And you've heard yourself saying that, the story of population growth in a way is a story of development success to some extent, right? We see people living healthier lives, they're living longer, they're having healthier children, there's better education. All of those are indicators of what we consider as, human development progress. But the narratives around demographic shifts also tend to be polarizing. We hear stories around, a young population being destabilizing, or a large young population being destabilizing, or an aging population being burdensome, or, often the threat of migration. And the concerns that I have is that these narratives not only tend to overlook sort of the complexities around demographics, they also turn these demographic trends into headlines of yet another, crisis. But more importantly, they fail to prepare societies for the future. And it brings me to the second point, and I wonder whether my fellow panelists agree, which is that, although obviously demographics challenge and also provide opportunities to development trajectories of countries, they do tend to be slower moving. They do tend to be more predictable compared to other trends. That's why we refer to them sometimes as drivers or et cetera, or megatrends. But there are other intersecting trends that we have to pay attention to, and I think James spoke a little bit about that, which are the trends that are much faster moving and volatile that we tend to neglect. I mean, you spoke about, and we know just at the end of 2022, for example, there were over 1 million people forcibly displaced because of either conflict or human rights violations or persecutions. We know that the effects of climate change and the impact on extreme weather events are getting people to move. With estimates of up to 1.5 billion people potentially, 1.2 billion people potentially becoming climate refugees by 2050 if we continue down this path. And it's not just about forced displacement. I mean, we know also that societal shifts towards how we work are also having a role. There are an increasing number of digital nomads who perceive their office as potentially being anywhere, and I'm sure there are many, many here in this room. And the last point that I wanted to make is that just as we can't look at demographics as an isolation, it intersects with many of these other trends. Population policies also have to be seen within a wider context, and they can't be designed in isolation. And many of the challenges that we're seeing related to population shifts, whether it's population growth or population decline, have far more to do with other aspects that underpin sustainable development, like gender equality or our development models, the importance of decarbonization, than simply population dynamics per se. And what we see oftentimes with many governments, especially, for example, the ones facing depopulation is that they tend to focus on policies that try to address or reverse, for example, or increase birth rates. And we have concrete examples of that. Whereas we know, for example, that if you were to include greater participation of women in the labor force, just achieving gender parity would do more for sustaining economies in low fertility aging societies than simply trying to focus on increasing birth rates alone. So in a nutshell, I think we have to overcome these divisive narratives that frankly I think ignore our interdependence. And I think the question should be not just about how do we make more or have more or fewer children, but more importantly, how do we govern society so that everybody thrives?
Definitely the importance of context is coming through once again, that population numbers don't just come out of nowhere, and they don't just go nowhere either. Yeah. They are affected, and they are affected by, and they in turn affect so many other factors of human development and well-being. So James, why don't you build on what we've heard about these nuanced demographic challenges, different places, different times, different solutions, right?
Quite. There's huge challenges in different parts of the world. If you look at what's happening, Alex correctly flagged, Korea is a really interesting case here, where you've had a birth rate that's collapsed so quickly that you've just completely changed the underlying growth trajectory of an economy sort of overnight, because suddenly you have to do other things differently. Those other things differently could be more female participation in the workforce. It could be more automation. It could be thinking seriously about some of the other policy changes that come with an elderly population. And this is something that we are, as a Brit, are going to face in our country in the years to come. Our birth rate is currently about 1.5, 1.6 children per woman, but it's falling quickly. And I think one of the big questions we have to ask when thinking about demographics is, what if those numbers go below 1? Suddenly you are thinking about quite a substantially different situation in terms of your demographic trajectory, either in terms of total population or in terms of the makeup of where that population growth comes from. Maybe you have slightly higher immigration flows, and that means a completely different policy setting as well. So you need to think about all of these things sort of in tandem. There's also going to have to be some serious questions in many Western economies about retirement ages. And I regularly joke that the reason I will never be elected Prime Minister of the UK is my flagship policy would be raising the retirement age. And even my mum wouldn't vote for me if I said that. But it's just one of those things that we realistically have to get our heads around, because policymakers for years and years and years have been like ostriches when it comes to demographic shifts. We refuse to acknowledge this sort of slowly moving but substantial force in the global economy, and we refuse to make these big changes. So you look at retirement ages around the world, they were set back when life expectancy was in your 60s or 70s. Yeah. And there's more and more people, thanks to good news, are living till 80, 90, 100. Well, something has to change, and we live in a society where luckily more and more jobs are becoming less manual in nature, which means actually working longer should be possible, should be something we have to think seriously about. There's going to have to be substantial questions about healthcare provision, about taxation in most countries in the world, to think about the changes that are coming in terms of population pyramids. And as well as going back to some of the points mentioned, this migration question. We know that migration in many economies is going to be higher. We need to think seriously about how we integrate people into workforces, how we integrate people into societies, how we build the right infrastructure. These are big questions that I think a lot of countries in the years to come are going to have to think seriously about. And the country that really sticks out to me on this in recent history is Sweden, which is almost famous for having a very, very open immigration policy in terms of how easy it used to be, at least, to turn up in Sweden and start working and get embedded in society. That hasn't worked as well as politicians hoped in terms of integrating people in, and they've had to reverse a lot of their open immigration policies. And it's a sort of a lesson, I think, for the rest of the world. If we know that migration is going to play a bigger and bigger role in global demographics across the world, we need to think seriously about how we're allowing people who moved countries to integrate into society, into labour forces, and to actually reap the benefits of population growth and a more, a more sort of mixed world. There's huge amounts of opportunities that come from that. We've got to make sure we can harness them.
Great. Alex, what do you make of that? Retirement age, migration policies, and are there any other things that you think we as futurists need to keep our eyes on in order to try and get ahead of some unknown or unknowable risks and opportunities?
Thanks, Josh. I think one of the first things to think about is when we shift our gaze on future population decline from aging and the care economy to a broader conversation around the implications of population decline, then we'll begin to look at how it intersects with almost every other aspect of our lives. Think about cities and the future of urbanization and the future of cities. If the population of Seoul drops by 50%, what will happen to housing stock? What will happen to the education system? What will happen to urban systems and stuff like that? And I think it gives us the space to begin to dream what needs to change in that new environment to sustain life and well-being. In some parts of the world today, issues of vacant housing is a major social problem. How do you deal with that? And we don't even often connect it back to population decline within those spaces. We think about population change as living longer, healthier lives. But in many of the countries that will be getting there, they will be declining when the life expectancy is still below 70 years, when they are still very poor. So the long, healthy lives may not be their experience. So what does that mean in that context? So always, I think, as we think about this new framing of the future of population, it opens the door to really begin to look at the implications beyond what we are used to of aging and the care economy. That is something that affects every other aspect of society, and we need to be modeling for those and looking at what the policy options and solutions should be.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so moving on to policy options, you said it, Alex. Let's circle back to Narue. I told you the panel would be an interdisciplinarian's dream, right? And it's definitely shaping up that way. Can you talk a bit more about some of the cross-border, cross-organization, cross-disciplinary work that you do with UNDP in order to connect demographics to other policy areas?
The types of challenges confronting countries today, I think the complexity and the dynamic nature of the issues that they have to cope with are such that we often refer to them as interconnected puzzles of multidimensional risk, and risk understood not just as threats but also opportunities. But that means that the solutions then have to be systemic. They can't be sector specific, or they don't necessarily operate in isolation. I think part of a lot of our work has been and is fundamentally helping countries manage, enact change. And what we're doing is precisely helping countries accelerate and manage transitions, particularly the green transitions, the digital transitions, but obviously doing so in a way that's fair, right? In a way that provides everyone and the last person the opportunity to thrive and the opportunity to do so in a resilient way. And I think this is where futures and foresight is so important, and that's frankly why we are building those capabilities across the organization. We have the benefit of operating in 170 countries. We have just about every nationality represented in our workforce, and we are a very distributed network. So what we're trying to do is to harness that network, to harness the interdisciplinary nature of our own cadre of the disciplines that we work with, and we're having a distributed sensory network to be able to perceive change as soon as virtually possible, and to share those signals of change across the network. So if somebody's sitting in Burundi or can share experiences with anywhere else in the world, and we can make sense of those changes ultimately, so we can be better at what we do, which is helping countries achieve sustainable development.
Super, thanks. And I'm reminded of what we heard this morning, which is what got us to where we are today isn't going to be enough for where we want to get to in the future. We have about 10-15 minutes left on this panel, and I see some hands are already preparing to go up for our Q&A. So let's give everyone a moment just to stretch and put your hands up if you have a question. I'm going to take 3, and then the panel will be able to respond to 1, 2, or all 3 of them as they wish in turn.
So I've been in the futurists since about the mid-1980s, and again, We saw this coming. We knew three things in the US. We knew we were an aging population. We knew we were going to be a minority-majority population. And we knew the baby boomers would finally start to die. So my provocative statement here is that I think we've had a failure in our foresight work on this because we had the data. The demographic data is the best. We have projections out 100 years. We have scenarios of those projections. Our US Census Bureau fed us all this data, but here we are, we're having a crisis, multiple crises over this, and how did we fail to avert these crises? And I'm just worried we're going to repeat this. So now going forward, what are we as futurists going to do to avert crises?
Adam Sharp with UNICEF in Achenti, but I'm not wearing my UNICEF hat here. I also have a population demographics foresight game that I've been playing for the last year and a half. One thing we need to be as futurists very wary of is that demographics could be a human rights battleground of the 21st century. And my point here is seeing signals from some countries like China who have been removing vasectomies from hospital procedure lists. We saw a decline in vasectomies in China from 250,000 to 5,000 in 1 year after that happened. And also sex education being removed from some school curriculums. So how do we address population decline whilst averting a human rights battleground, particularly around women and their rights over their bodies? And another point is, one of the biggest global studies on this interviewed thousands of childless women around the world to find out why. About 10 years ago now, 10% couldn't because they were infertile, they couldn't have children. Another 10% decided they did not want to, and another 80% had always planned on having children, but it never quite happened. It happened too late, they didn't meet the right person, and I, having just had a child myself, I feel like my wife, she can't win. She's a very ambitious career woman. She gets lambasted from that. She wants to focus on her child. She feels bad for that. I feel like women can't win. So I think what systemic shifts could also enable women who want to have children to have them at an age where it's more possible. So those are how do we avert this human rights battleground? Thank you.
Question on systemic shifts there, and maybe also a bit about tools and policy approaches at our disposal. We'll take one more question this round. Front row here with the SDGs badge.
Thanks for the great panel so far. Sean Robertson from Innovation and Insight. We've had a really interesting discussion here where we've heard about massive depopulation in more developed economies where aging and retirement are bigger concerns, while we also have the potential for 1.2 to 1.5 billion climate refugees in 2050. So if we have these massive immigration or migration, whichever way you want to call it, from the LMIC world potentially to other LMICs or to more developed nations, as a Canadian, we've struggled with the politics of immigration for a long, long time. And I think that we're doing a good job bringing people into the workforce, but the politics is a big challenge. So what is the futurist perspective on the political situation with changing demographics in various economies? Thank you.
So I'll rephrase them very quickly to you, and you can respond to a combination or take them in turn. So we heard from Annette asking about, well, if we know what futures are emerging, why aren't we doing what we need to be doing about them when we're aware of them and when we have a chance to act on them? Then we heard from Adam with a large array of different issues around some of the sensitivities, but also some of the tools and policy options. And we heard from Sean also about the politicization of various aspects of demographics. So let's go in reverse order this time. Narue, are you okay to get us started on those?
Sure, and maybe I'll just start, I think, with a comment on the last point made about, we know, well, first we knew that this was going to happen, and if we knew that these trends were evolving, and I'm not saying that we did, but I think it just speaks to the types of governance failures that we face, and whether that's population or whether that's climate or others, and frankly that's not the lack of knowledge, but it's the ability for us to be able to govern societies, but frankly the world in a way that's sustainable. And to the last point about, we know that while many economies and 15 of the largest economies actually in the world are not replacing their populations fast enough to stave off, labor shortages. We have in sub-Saharan Africa a growing young population. They're going to be in need, for jobs, good jobs and decent jobs. So, that can only be met if we invest in human capital for the economies of the future. That can only be achieved, and the only way that they will be able to reap the demographic dividends of this youth bulge is through investments ultimately in human capital. And for aging societies, on the other hand, it's not just pensions or retirement ages that are going to need an overhaul, but primarily immigration policies, quite frankly.
Thanks. Over to you, Alex.
Okay, just maybe 2 quick points to mention. One is, because of the limited research that's gone into population decline in low and middle income countries, policy options are not very evident. We don't really know a lot what to do. Even in higher income countries, we don't. So the president of South Korea recently said that the country has spent $200 billion over the last 16 years to improve fertility, but they've not achieved anything. And so when you think about it, what's the policy option there? Is that they are giving money to families with children under 1. You've already had a child. What if the policy changes to really supporting women to combine career and childbearing, or individual women who want to have children without a husband to be able to do so without the social stigma and all that? Are there many other different things that could be done? In the UK, there was a recent article that talked about taxing childless individuals and couples. And the question there is, why are they not having children? Some of them maybe because they are not able to provide for their children the type of life they had growing up. And so by taxing them, you're actually delaying their ability to be able to do that and to have children. And what if the policy option is to provide better child care and housing and all of those for young couples? So there are things that we could be doing that we are not, because the evidence to guide these things are not there. And I'm suggesting that the more, and I want to make the second point. We talk about migration as if it is a panacea for these problems. It's a temporary solution. Because even in the places where these people are coming from, the largest group of immigrants, black immigrants in the US is from Jamaica and in the UK. Jamaica, the population will move from 3 million to less than 1 million. They are not going to continue to be an infinite draw of people from this place. Their fertility is also changing significantly. So we need to be thinking about this holistically and thinking, what is happening in the sending countries? And how does that affect our own policy options in the north? So there are a lot of questions, but I think that the solutions are not simple, but they are not things that we cannot do if we put our mind to it. I think the key point is to recognize that it's a future that we are facing. And the reason why we're not doing a lot of the things that was talked about by the first question is there are a lot of political, it's almost like a political landmine. And we've made a lot of mistakes in the past when it came to population issues. And those things are holding us back from thinking more creatively on what we could do going forward. So recognizing the mistakes of the past, I think, is very important. And speaking to those and saying, how do we do things differently in this new phase?
Great. And so I'll try and answer all three of these in sort of one coherent blob of information. So in terms of the first question, essentially why is because of politics. Because no one wins an election by making policies that make your country better in 20 years' time. If I go back to my sort of half-hearted joke that I'd raise the retirement age to 70, that's what we need to do. We know the trajectory of populations means we need to do that. But good luck anyone trying to put those policies in place in anywhere where we're going to win an election within the next 2 or 3 years. It becomes harder now. It gets harder and harder every year because the shape of population is getting older. So if you're 20 and the retirement age goes from 65 to 70, it's a rounding error on your career. If you're 60, suddenly you're doubling your career. So if the population is getting older, it becomes harder and harder to make these decisions. And I think what you need is essentially a lot of these big picture changes in society need to be made outside of the political sphere. They need to be made independently, because otherwise no government is going to make the changes they need to do, because they're worried about elections. In terms of the human rights side of things and in terms of birth rates, I think it's really interesting because, and it touches on something that Alex just alluded to, there's loads and loads of reasons why people aren't having as many children in developed economies, and they're wide-ranging. They go from concerns about climate change and the future of humanity. They go from essentially not being able to afford it, as Alex just alluded to. You make that worse if you tax people, but there's a whole generation of people across the developed world who cannot afford to buy a home and will never be able to afford to buy a home. They cannot afford to rent a home that's big enough to fit them and a spare room for a child in. If that's a problem, you cannot fundamentally increase birth rates. There is almost a cap here on what can happen. But the problem is, going back to what Alex alluded to earlier, do you now go and build tons of houses knowing that in 20 or 30 years' time you're not going to need them all? That's a whole other question. So you've got all those challenges. There's also big social changes going on. More women in the workforce is great, but it does, as Subi alluded to in your question, makes it harder and harder in terms of people pushing starting to have kids later and later in life. So then actually you end up having fewer children, partly then that brings us down the fertility angle as well, because if you have children later, it becomes harder. All of these things require different solutions. So there's not a golden sort of bullet here that can fix fertility challenges in Western economies. All of these different things are going to be a different role in different places. But as Alex alluded to, childcare is a huge part of this, because if you look in the data, you look across the developed world, the countries that have the higher birth rates are those that have the better childcare policies. They spend the most money on those things. You take somewhere like Sweden or Norway or Denmark, they have higher birth rates than the rest of Europe. They're still below 2 though. They're still having shrinking populations. So it's not a golden bullet either. In terms of the migration side, it's a huge challenge that I think everyone's got to get used to, and it goes back to sort of about framing of policy. You know, there's a sort of rhetoric of migration equals bad in the sort of the discourse in a lot of Western economies, that it's seen as a threat rather than opportunity. Talking to people, making it very clear that huge challenges we face in society in terms of aging population, shrinking tax takes, shortages of workers, all of these things, changing that rhetoric towards things. May not have come across that clearly during the course of the last half an hour. I'm an optimist, and the reason the reason I'm optimistic that some of these things will change is because I think demographics brings with it is another thing, which is a cohort effect. And I think you're going to get a generation of people who have grown up in much more mixed societies, who have a very, very different view of immigration and a very different view to different cultures than their parents. And I think that will matter. And I think it will matter when that generation becomes in power. I think it will matter when those people are business leaders. I think it will help to change that dynamic. And that's what gives me hope. Actually, today's young people, I think, are much more open to a lot of these things. And I think that might be where things start to change, partly a necessity and partly a cultural thing.
All right. We have 5 more minutes, and I think what we can do is take 2 more questions and then have a one-liner from each of the panel to try and respond to them.
Hello, hi, thank you. It's Angela from London, well, by ways of immigration. And I work at the consumer insight space, and specifically looking at people's changing values and behaviors and how that shapes our future. And this conversation is fascinating because it's precisely women's changing values on having children that is creating this kind of seismic shift you are talking about. And we're talking a lot about putting a plaster on it and creating policies that mainly penalize people, like, you know, not letting people having more than 1 children, or then taxing them if they are having less than 1 children, and so on. So, you know, all of those things are kind of operational, kind of trying to regulate the system. But in your work in demographic changes, do you see anyone doing anything interesting around helping people's values change and bring those values across in the generations that will then impact demographics?
I'm Isabel, strategist from London. 2 thoughts. I think we've been looking a lot at like what's going on now and what we can do now, but can we look a little bit further as futurists and say, actually, parenting is unsustainable. It needs to be a full-time, well-paid job as a policy idea. And the other one is retirement is an outdated concept. Can we start talking about something far more valuable? And maybe we've been overestimating how much retirement really matters to people.
one or two line response from each of our panelists. Narue, ready to go?
Sure. I
Over
think
to
what
you.
comes to mind, I think, is what you were talking about in terms of this conversation becoming a risk in terms of, rolling back progress that's been made on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and having the conversation be about whether or not women have or not more children, whereas, as we've heard, it is all about the conditions that make societies thrive. It's the reasons why women want to or can or might, but at the end of the day, it should be a choice. Right, and I think that this is where the debate has to be framed, and it's around the conditions for people to want to stay in a society, or conditions for people to want to come back to the countries they're from. So I think that should be the focus of it. And I think in terms of, I think the question about retirement is really important, because we're also tending to see a shift in the composition of societies with current frames of mind. And anyway, there are countries that are setting up universities for the, I shouldn't even say elderly, but for 50 plus, and so these are the kinds of ideas that I think we need to be thinking of.
Thank you so much. And with similar brevity, please, Alex.
Okay, thanks. For me, I think one of the key issues, this is not based on my research evidence and other, but it's easier to implement policies and programs that could reduce fertility, because you can make, many times women desire fewer children than they have. So by providing contraception, those who want fewer children can easily receive it and therefore reduce fertility. It's much harder to actually get women who do not want to have a child to have a child. And that's where the point that Adam made before becomes very important, that we have to be able to respect those individual decisions. And I think policy has to revolve around what can you do to facilitate that and a change and a shift. And that's where I share James's optimism that maybe there's a new generation coming who will see, actually, it's not just seeing it as part of my contribution to society and order to have another child. The challenge is the cost of childbearing is massive. It's in tens and hundreds of thousands of, you have a child today, you are committed to that investment for the next 20, 30 years. In fact, for the rest of your life. And policy options are so limited. Is in the first year, is in the second year. Is what happens to college education in the US if you have to pay $60,000 for one child for a year to go to college?
Two sentences. Firstly, I'm going to now change my policy from 70 retirement age to no retirement. This is helpful. It goes even further. And secondly, I think cultural change is something that takes a long, long time to come through in terms of addressing all of these things we've discussed about in terms of attitudes towards childcare and all these various things. One thing that's shocked that is the pandemic. And the pandemic has probably changed quite a lot of people's attitudes towards having children in the near term, and whether that persists, let's wait and see. There seems to be an overweight on people's willingness or want to travel, to experience things. All of those things become slightly harder when you've got young children. So there could be an element of that delaying structural change towards those things, but I'm reasonably hopeful, fingers crossed, that we do see a bigger policy and society-led solution that leads us down a path of maybe birth rates picking up further down the line.
Thank you so much, James. Right, we're coming to the end of this panel now. We can have a round of applause for our fantastic panelists. I've certainly taken away the importance of appreciating complexity and how our narratives are never just one thing. And I think that's a good insight for us to all take away as we proceed into the rest of Dubai Future Forum. Enjoy the rest of the event, everyone, and thank you for attending.